Hello. We are talking. This was fun and exciting to Jeffrey Lewis, who is you created Arms Control Wonk, the blog and podcast and etc. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. I've given myself the fancy title of founding publisher, which just means dude who had a blog in the early 2000s.
And you think a lot about arms control, and I am writing a video about why there aren't more countries that have nuclear weapons. So I thought that you'd be a pretty good guy to talk to, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure, it's going to be fun.
Okay, I believe you. I'm sure it won't be stressful at all.
Nuclear weapons are really interesting.
Woo! Yeah. Yes. So I guess my first question is why aren't there more countries that have nuclear weapons? Give me the broad overview.
Right. Well, there are kind of two reasons for that. One is it's actually not that easy to make the material that goes into nuclear weapons. So there's a relatively high barrier to entry. But then on top of that, in the 1960s, after China's first nuclear test, the world negotiated something called the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it's been pretty successful. You know, it really has established the norm that countries that have nuclear weapons should work to get rid of them. And in the meantime, nobody else should acquire them. And so, we can talk about why the treaties worked or, the challenges it's had. But generally speaking, today, people have this idea that nuclear weapons are kind of a bad thing and that countries that are trying to get nuclear weapons are somehow morally suspect. And that's a big change because that's not how people thought about it in the 1960s.
Right. So it's kind of like if you've got a nuclear program, you're kind of wading into the muck with a lot of suspect characters.
Yeah, I mean, like we think of we call it nuclear proliferation, right? The spread of nuclear weapons. We think of countries that want nuclear weapons as being like rogue states, That's not what people thought in the 50s and 60s. In the 50s and 60s, nuclear weapons were like just the fanciest new weapon, and the expectation is that, anyone who had a modern military would eventually acquire this capability. So that was a pretty big conceptual change.
So I guess how did the NPT achieve that? Was it partially like seeing countries like China that were sort of outside of our conception of traditionally big, uh, powerful militaries become nuclear powers? Was it also that like we were realizing that maybe the bombs that we dropped during World War II were very powerful, but not anywhere near as powerful as nuclear weapons could be?
Yeah, I mean, it's sad to say that racism played a role, but it did. It was one thing when Russia got nuclear weapons and when France and when the United Kingdom, but I think for a lot of people, the idea of China and like Mao Zedong's China getting the bomb was really jarring. And so I think what there was a kind of change in how people looked at nuclear weapons that was driven by the kind of threat of the arms race, the idea that thermonuclear weapons now existed. And so, people were very anxious about the US Soviet arms race. And then I think the idea that this wasn't going to just be an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, but really was, a capability that many, many more countries might have. And Mao Zedong was, pretty terrifying dude when you think about it. I think that led to a kind of recognition of like, oh, these really aren't just another weapon, and that there is something unwise about basing our security on these weapons indefinitely. And like any kind of normative change, like it didn't happen all at once. There are still lots of people who don't believe it. It's not like this is a settled matter. There's still people who love nuclear weapons. We still have them in the United States. But I think I don't know. I would say that the NPT caused that change, but maybe it reflected an intellectual change where a lot of countries felt like that the spread of nuclear weapons into their national security situation would be a bad thing. And like there have always been exceptions. And there's also like a coercive element. The United States exerted a lot of pressure on its allies at first, very kind of gingerly, but then later more enthusiastically to
Mm-hmm.
discourage countries like South Korea and Taiwan from building nuclear weapons.
Was there so what about now? Like what about why is it a good reason for a country today if you're South Sudan,
Right.
why would you not have signed the NPT and why would you? What's the good reason
Sure.
why you do it?
Well, I mean, part of the question is, well, what makes for a good reason? For a lot of countries, the reason one signs the NPT is just to avoid the isolation and stigma that nuclear weapons would come along with. I mean, if you look at the countries that are actively seeking nuclear weapons or now in this case expanding their nuclear arsenal, it's like North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Mm-hmm.
most countries don't look at North Korea like, oh, that's a successful development model. And well, I mean,
Yeah.
it's funny. The social science research is actually pretty good on this now. That when we really dig into why countries do and do not build nuclear weapons, it has a lot to do with when the decision is being made and how leaders think of themselves. So, somebody like Kim Jong Un sees himself as a kind of authoritarian leader who is threatened by the United States and is already isolated. For him, nuclear weapons seem like a great idea. But there are a lot of
Mm-hmm.
countries who look at Kim Jong Un and think like, gee, I don't really want to get into the Saddam, Gaddafi, Kim case. Because if you don't get the nuclear weapons, the ending of that can be a little rough. And so leaders who think of themselves as being, kind of cosmopolitan and focused on trade and development and openness, like they tend to look at nuclear weapons, more skeptically. So, like the good reason for signing the NPT is you don't find yourself isolated.
So if you don't sign, are there like automatic, is it just sort of like general, like we're
Mhm.
suspicious of you, or is there like actual repercussions?
It depends.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I say it depends is all the historical cases happened at different periods in time. So like
Mm-hmm.
the Brazilians and the Argentines were very reluctant to sign. They didn't sign
Mm-hmm.
until the 1990s. Um, and they had weapons programs, but also their view was that, the NPT was discriminatory and that this was really an issue for Brazil and Argentina to deal with. And they came up with their own regional arrangements, which have been kind of now integrated into the NPT structure now that they've signed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we didn't really look at them quite as skeptically as we did, say, other countries. Generally speaking, we now have a situation where the NPT is pretty much universal, with the exceptions of India, Israel, Pakistan, and then North Korea, which is withdrawn. So really, you'd be talking about a country that chose to leave the NPT, right? And
Right.
so
Yeah.
that would
But
that's a different
I'm
kind of
curious
decision.
about
Yeah,
like why in the 80s and 90s, why in the 70s
yeah.
the like countries were signing up. Like what was
Right.
the benefit? And I'm also curious about like
Uh,
just sort of the straight up like most countries don't want nuclear weapons. Like that
right.
ultimately, like the reason why most countries don't have nuclear weapons is because they don't want them.
Right.
And so of course that's more complicated than that. Like what are all the reasons why they don't
I
want
got it.
them? They're
I got it.
expensive. They get more expensive when you
Right.
include sanctions and the fact that you're going to be violating
That's
a
right.
treaty that you signed. And then also like there are these norms. And I think that this like the establishment of this
Got it.
international norm is so interesting because like how does a norm get established by a global community? And was that a reflection of a world that existed in the 60s and 70s and 80s that kind of maybe doesn't anymore?
Right. I see. Okay, so the first thing is I would go back to the very first thing I said, which is the barrier to entry is high.
Right. Right.
Um,
Uranium-235 is hard to make.
yes. Well, and you're going to want to and not only is it a significant industrial investment, it's an investment that has to play out over time. So, like, you get a lot of countries that talk about building nuclear weapons, that threaten to build
Mm-hmm.
nuclear weapons, that start kind of exploratory programs, but a lot of them just fall by the wayside because it's hard to sustain the effort over the period of time you need to. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and by the way, conversely, we found that when barriers to entry fall, you get a whole bunch of new nuclear aspirants. So when AQ Khan in Pakistan helped set up what basically was like a nuclear black market, made it much easier. We saw the North Koreans, who already had nuclear weapons from a different means, they picked up that program. The Iranians picked up a program. The Libyans, so the barrier to entry is a big deal. And that, by the way, that barrier to entry is falling. Right. So I think we're shifting from a period when we had the high barrier of entry and a high chance of detection to an era where barriers will be lower and the chances of detection will be lower.
And this is because export controls aren't working as well?
Well, it's an archaic technology. There are two pieces to it. One is that, the United States did this in the 1940s. 1940s technology is just old.
Yeah.
Right?
But it's also like it's still physically difficult. Like these things are not easy to, like, it takes a lot of materials and resources to build.
So then that's the other thing that has changed, particularly for uranium enrichment. You're frozen. Can you hear me?
No, you dropped out too, but I think we're good now.
Okay, so that's true, except there are changes that are happening. Like for building a reactor, that's still a large industrial enterprise that would take time and money and very likely be detected. But what we've seen, and AQCOM was kind of the first hint of this, and now we really see this playing out in North Korea, centrifuges as a manner to enrich uranium, which is a different route to the bomb, are much harder to find than, say, a gaseous diffusion plant, which was the archaic technology. So gaseous diffusion plants were huge and they were hot. And so the US basically never missed one. But centrifuges.
My wife just walked in. I'm wondering what's going on? Okay. Yeah, that would work. Okay. All right, I'm good.
Centrifuges, though, which were a really fancy technology in the 70s, but aren't now. Like if you look at the underlying kind of, that's basically computer-controlled machine tools to make them, which, again, like computers not as fancy now as they were in the 70s. Centrifuge plants are smaller and they don't give off the same level of heat. And so they're just harder to detect. And I think you see that in the discussion of we don't know how many secret enrichment sites North Korea has. So with the passage of time and the spread of technology, it's far easier to get away with building something than it was in the past.
Right. So the barrier of creating uranium-235 is going down. The barrier, the barrier of sanctions is still high. That still costs a lot, but I guess can kind of be pitched by the country as look at what the whole world is doing to us, not look what we are doing to us.
Right. So that's why you see regime type mattering. For a country like North Korea, the fact that they are beset on all sides by sanctions in some ways is a benefit. It fits with regime propaganda, but also it allows sanctions for North Korea. For the people who run North Korea, sanctions are good because it creates an off the books economy that's easy.
Why are we doing it then?
Because you got to be tough.
Well, tough. I mean, I guess there's a certain amount of we're doing it for you, so that because hey, look, we do this, in case someone else is on that path.
No, I mean, I joke, but I mean, I think it's a fundamental policy dysfunction that we have in DC, which is there are some people who want to bomb them, and then there's some people who don't want to bomb them. And the people who don't want to bomb them don't want to look like wimps. So they say oh, well, we'll sanction them. And the people who want to bomb them settle for sanctioning them. So it's it's bureaucratic satisficing, but there's no evidence that sanctions work.
And maybe even some indications that sanctions can help a country. Because I mean, obviously, a country like North Korea or Iran, less so, but yes, they're developing nuclear weapons because they are destabilized countries, because they are not part of the international community, because they are autocracies. The whole point, the reason why other countries don't is because they have productive relationships with other countries.
Well, and that's
so you start from a place of destabilization, and if it's almost good for an autocrat to have a more destabilized country.
That's right, and I think that's actually why you saw kind of the opposite thing play out, at least for a while. I don't know if it's sustainable given where we're headed now, but that's why that moment in Iran with the nuclear deal seems so promising, which is it had nothing to do with the Iranians suddenly becoming like lovely, the supreme leader didn't suddenly become a lovely guy. It's that there was an election and the person who won, right, conceived of his role as being opening Iran and reducing its isolation. So he wanted to solve that problem and get it off the books. But like if you were to get really, there are some tough characters you could find running Iran in another couple of years, and they may well be very delighted by the isolation, right? Because if the Iranian economy really tanks and they really become isolated, then like who's going to make money? Well, the Revolutionary Guard is going to like, end up running smuggling, and those guys are going to get real rich.
Right.
Weirdly, we saw the same thing. It had nothing to do with nuclear weapons, but we saw the same thing in Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia. His supporters were basically gangsters, and so a lot of the sanctions on Serbia served to make the people who supported the president rich.
And so this is so in some ways with barriers to entry falling and with sanctions not always being the right tool depending on the regime type, then you're talking about like what is the path?
Like you're in asking
or saying like or saying like, well, so you're gonna have nuclear weapons. Let's do it the right way, and we'll talk about how to like we can have a productive relationship after that. And it's not like that's never happened. Like it happened with India and Pakistan.
That's right.
Those countries created nuclear arsenals that we didn't want them to. They did it. We were mad at them, and then now we're okay, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I would still
with India at least.
Yeah, I would still like to start from the premise that we're going to try to discourage countries.
Because well, I mean, I think that like isn't the best discouragement creating a world in which it's not helpful to have nuclear weapons?
That's right. So the problem is we're still really focused on these coercive tools, which aren't as effective anymore, and we haven't thought creatively about what the positive inducements that we would want to create are, and we haven't really tried to address some of the underlying dynamics that push countries in this direction. And so when you kind of don't do that, then you get proliferation. And the challenge is, like, while I am someone who thinks we have to learn to live with like North Korea's bomb, because they're not giving it up, you do want to be careful.
So you're saying that they're not that Donald Trump didn't fix it?
Yeah, it's shocking, I know. But you don't want to create a situation where like this suddenly becomes a really appealing option for countries. I mean, we know we get
and like what is that?
And what Australians, and
right. What does that look like? Because I contacted Catherine Dill before I talked with you, and she was fantastic and wonderful to talk to.
She's one of our very finest graduates.
Nice. And we were talking a little bit about how like the part of this has been like having a pretty stable international situation and having really productive and good relationships with our allies. And I'm like looking at NATO, like what's happening
that's right
now. And that's like, oh, okay. Like this is exactly the sort of thing that has
exactly right.
Proliferation at bay.
That's precisely right. I mean, that's why Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons. I mean, it's always more complicated than that, of course, because there are a lot of people in Japan who don't want nuclear weapons.
Right.
But it's not one tool. It's all of the tools. You have a security relationship with Japan so that they don't need weapons. You have a broad-based normative movement where generally people think nuclear weapons are terrible ways to, fight wars because they're indiscriminate and kill lots of civilians. There are some coercive pieces, which is, by the way, if you go down the nuclear weapons route, then you give up all this great stuff. If you put all that stuff together, then you have like a viable strategy. It's just that I think we're now in the business of like over relying on the coercive tools, which are less effective, and then neglecting all of the positive inducements, like, for example, NATO.
Right. And that positive inducement in NATO being like, we have first of all, the U.S. has thousands of nuclear weapons that we can put under. We can put you under our umbrella. kinda thing. But are there also like would there be ways to say to, I don't know, like a country like Iran or North Korea, I don't really see this, but I do see it in just generally like it's good to be a part of the international community for most countries.
Oh, well, I see it with Iran. I mean, that's the fight that the Iranians are having among themselves, is they elected a
Yeah.
leadership that, I mean, Rouhani, who, like, let's not be under any illusions about, like, how reformist he is, but he still campaigned on reducing Iran's international isolation. There are still a lot of people in Iran who want a different future for that country, and they voted for him for that reason, right? So, you can, I think, make this pitch. Like with North Korea, it's probably too late.
Right.
Because they already have the weapons. But for a country that doesn't have them and is thinking about it, you know, I think, we can collectively offer positive inducements. Sweden is a famous example, which I know, nobody would really care if Sweden built the bomb. But in the 50s, Sweden had a really serious bomb program. And in the 1960s, it kind of slowed down. And ultimately, they decided that, like, it would, a nuclear weapon in Sweden would draw them into hostility with the Soviet Union. And that, frankly, they were just better off sort of as an integrated, normal European country. And so, like we today take those decisions for granted because we can't imagine Sweden or Australia building nuclear weapons. But, like, the reason we can't imagine it is because we created security environments for them in which it was unimaginable. Like, you could work and solve. No, well, we did it in South America. Well, we didn't do it. The South Americans did it themselves. The Argentines and Brazilians had bomb programs for one another. And so if they can resolve that issue, then, we got to find a way to get the Iranians, at peace with their neighbors.
Right.
I know it's not easy, but, like, I mean, so it is easy to be. I know that feeling. Like, it seems like it's impossible, but the flip side of it is you just let the science experiment run, and then like, then you end up in a day when lots of people die, and people are like, well, why the hell didn't you stop it, right? Like, why didn't we do more? And I personally don't ever want to be in the position of saying, like, well, I thought about it, it was too hard.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
I want to ask a big one, which is, do you feel like when you look back at the last 75 years of humans having access to nuclear weapons, like, does this seem like a really good scenario that we actually ended up in? Like, it's pretty good.
Yeah,
actually.
You know what that's called? Survivor bias. Like,
okay.
Right? Like,
but like, it's the whole point, so it's not that biased.
Well, no, it's survivor bias. Like if you go to someone who's successful in a field and you ask, like, how did you get to this field? And they tell you their story. It would actually be a mistake to try to replicate the path of someone who was successful, because lots of people probably made those same decisions and didn't make it.
Yeah, but no Earths made the same decisions and didn't make it.
Well, it's because we only run the experiment once. So I tend to think.
But so far, it's 100% success rate.
Yeah, well, I do think that we got. Well, I mean, I keep coming back to survivor bias. I mean, I don't think our choices have been great, but we haven't had to pay for them yet. And so, I feel pretty strongly that we need to make different choices. And I worry that sometimes, because nothing bad has happened, although, tell that to the people of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, I think we sometimes have this idea that, like, well, if there's a limited nuclear use, then we'll all come to our senses. And like, well, there was a limited nuclear use. We didn't all come to our senses, and we have those lessons in front of them, and we can learn them now.
Senses for 75 years. The question is, like, now that we've forgotten, and now that we haven't been scared out of our minds for 20 years or 30 years after, or 50 years after.
So I do think that, I mean, as somebody who studies the history of the Cold War, I think with distance, we assume it operated far more smoothly than it really did. And I think that when we delve into specific cases where deterrence did not function the way it was supposed to, and we try to explain why we got lucky and why things breaking down didn't result in a catastrophe, often there are not comforting answers. We don't, it's not like, oh, well, there were enough safeguards in place. You kind of look at the story and you're like, oh, it would have been very easy for that story to end badly. So I think we have gotten a little complacent with distance about how functional deterrence was in the Cold War. It was a much more near run thing.
Yeah.
Let's say this: I would not want to do the Cuban Missile Crisis with Donald Trump in the Oval Office.
I just in general not want to rerun that experiment.
Yeah.
So this is a much more specific question,
Yeah.
but I was surprised when researching this to find that like part of the Ukraine giving its nuclear weapons back to Russia was an agreement to say you can never violate our borders again, and then they did that. And like things like that to me seem like, no, we created these rules for such specific reasons.
Yeah.
And like, why ever violate that?
Right. I mean, I will say, I think Ukraine gets overdone a little bit in this conversation because those were Soviet nuclear weapons and the Ukrainians didn't really have the capacity to produce and sustain them. So for the Ukrainians,
it's funny that you say that it gets overplayed because I literally have never heard that out of any pundit's mouth. I've never heard it in a news article.
Oh, really?
I'm sure that you hear about it all the time.
I hear it all the time. But there are other cases, right? Well, but first of all, it's not a wildly inappropriate thing to discuss because it clearly was part of the thinking was you sign the NPT, because the Ukrainians could have asserted like, well, we're successors to the Soviets, so we're nuclear weapon states, we can go build our own. Like we tried to make it appealing for them to agree to be a non-nuclear weapon state, and the way they're getting treated by Russia, so it's like, well, and I mean, speaking of, if you imagine countries we don't like, Gaddafi gave up his WMD programs and it did not end well. So,
that seems questionable.
Yeah. So I think you get to the point where you want to create security situations that reward countries for giving up nuclear weapons and not punish them. And if you don't do that piece, if you don't find ways to help countries provide for their security, then they're going to find those ways themselves. And I think that's what happened in North Korea.
Fascinating, interesting, and intense. I'm going to let you get back to your life. I know that you're very busy, but I really, really appreciate you having this chat with me. It's super helpful.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Is it okay if I give you credit or say that I talked to you in the notes of my video?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.